And that's why I kind of asked the obvious question of what is steampunk, because one of the challenges Jeff and I had in composing this book was trying to find the line that all the ideas cross. And we came up against a lot of labels. For instance, when we discussed Steampunk Magazine, we actually discuss it more in the context of green punk. And when we discuss the work of Jaymee and Ay-Leen, we talk about it in the context of futurist steampunk and the multicultural exploration and things like that. But I think the idea that everyone is trying to grasp at is getting beyond the narrow labels of steampunk or just the punk suffix alone. And one question that I actually have is for Jake and Joey. Joey, it's the art versus maker label. There's makers, there are artists. But they both kind of have a similar goal in creating this thing that didn't exist in the world before. Joey, do you consider yourself a maker or an artist?
Both.
What is the...
I don't think there's a line.
Tell me more.
I don't think there's really a line to it for me, because I've always been an artist who makes things, just because the steampunk label happened to fall into it. I mean, I've always been a prop maker, a puppet maker, designer of all sorts of crazy inventions. But I mean, first and foremost, I'm an artist. The maker portion of it, I didn't really hear of the term until I landed in the steampunk realm. But in the theme park design realm, I mean, that's what I primarily did. So I was making, whether it was small contraptions that were props or a 60-foot T-Rex. I'm still an artist that is also a maker. So I don't really see a line drawn down the middle, except kind of in the steampunk world. But it's still, I don't think there's a bad negative aspect to either side of it.
Yeah, if I could speak to the same thing, I think, first point, I think the maker versus artist question in some of my experience has been people trying to create a fight where there isn't one. I found myself on a panel, artist versus maker, with Tom Williford of Brute Force, and we had very little to talk about because we were exactly on the same page. But the organizers of the con had us on, this was at SteamCon last year, had us on opposite sides. But we agreed completely. I call myself a maker for really kind of two reasons. One is my sister's a trained artist and an art teacher, and I haven't paid the dues she's paid. So I feel hesitant to call myself an artist because artists work hard to acquire their skills, and I'm kind of a hack. And then the flip side of that is there's a lot in the art world that's kind of political and kind of dumb, and I don't want to be a part of that. So I'd rather just put my stuff on the web and let people come see it.
Well, you discussed people slating artist and maker against each other, just so there's entertainment, so there's a fight. But
people like a fight.
Yeah, people do love a fight, but there are some issues within steampunk that need to be fought, and Ay-Leen and Jaymee have been consciously adapting the label steampunk to kind of use that as discourse for what you think needs to be fought for. Was there ever a moment when you wanted to reject the label steampunk, or has it really assisted the way that you converse about multiculturalism and post-colonialism and those issues that you discuss on your blog?
Sure. Okay. I guess I'm put on the spotlight here. What I find fascinating about steampunk is, as what's said before, everyone has their own definition. Everyone uses steampunk, which is essentially an aesthetic, in their own certain personal way. And so, with multicultural steampunk, I personally have always come from a background, in politics and in theater and performance. So, because for me, art as a form of self-expression is always political, because we don't live in a vacuum. We live in relationship to a greater society, and that society, has shifting power dynamics, which is reflected in politics. which is reflected in how people are portrayed in media, and how they are represented and understood by a dominant culture versus a marginalized culture. So so for me, steampunk is just another angle in which to examine these political dynamics and to really question the framework of how we construct a subculture of like what we idealize or romanticize about the dominant culture, and so that's why I really enjoy the label steampunk so much, because it's kind of like, oh, it's fun, it's tongue-in-cheek, but it makes a good point to me. I have had moments, however, where I feel like in the greater conversation of multiculturalism, it gets watered down to tokenism, or a bland sort of, oh, look at all the diversity, isn't this marvelous? I'm like, which I consider, well, it's equally bullshit if you don't examine the roots of that, or you don't examine the effects of it. So just because someone likes to go eat sushi every night and it owns a bunch of Japanese porcelain and likes to dress up in saris, does not necessarily mean that they understand what multiculturalism is. It just means they like to eat different things and own different things. And so when talking about multicultural steampunk, I just become very highly aware of how it's used by other people and how it's treated by other people, and whether their treatment of it is actually aware of the political and social dynamics of the word, or if it's just something faddish that they like to use to make themselves look better.
Yeah, and to kind of riff off that, the idea of, we're so multiculturalism, we're so cosmopolitan, we have all these world influences, like world music is really just kind of like the place where you put, music that doesn't sound white and mainstream. And to build off that, like multicultural steampunk, when I see it framed, like I actually actively rejected the label steampunk. I was actually like afraid to venture into steampunk. And it wasn't until I met Ay-Leen that I actually found a way to embrace this kind of like evoking of the past in a way that could be positive. Because when we're talking about multiculturalism, it's not about the things, it's about the people. And very often, it's a lot easier to talk about things than it is to talk about people, because people are complicated and messy and very, very, kind of messed up, right? And interacting with other people who are different from us also has its set of other problems, and that's kind of like why I took up the steampunk label, because the only alternative I had was neo-Victorianism, and that was far more alienating than steampunk. It's like, well, okay, neo-Victorianism, like I'd see all these pictures of like steampunks, and I'm like, okay, so you have to dress like that. And it's very evocative of this age of empire, which I'm pretty sure I would not actually have been able to dress like that had I actually been, trying for any sort of historical accuracy. And then, like, it took some time to process that steampunk is a modern thing. It's a postmodern thing even. And because of that, it is like people open to change and like people able to change. And that's kind of like how I slowly began to embrace the label of steampunk. Because if it is so postmodern, if it is rooted in the now, then I don't have to be deferred. My heritage does not have to be deferred. I'm not, I can place it front and center, and that's okay. And I'm a person, and I'm not just a thing. And to make, this very whitewashed picture look a bit more interesting. So that's kind of like how I began to navigate through it, and why I take up the work I do in order to kind of like center people who aren't normally centered in kind of more mainstream narratives.
Well, another way that we saw the label of steampunk kind of being, I can't think of the proper word, but rather than trying to pit people against each other in literature, it's actually opening a gateway for a new toolbox of a way to tell a story. Like Ekaterina said that she was not writing a steampunk novel, but she was adopted by the steampunk community with Alchemy of Stone, and I believe Heart of Iron. It's within a Victorian world, a slightly different one. But and then Margaret is also writing a sort of 19th century make your own adventure, which isn't steampunk, but could easily be adapted by that label. Do you guys see steampunk being appropriated by literature as more of a toolbox for writers to tell a story a certain way, as opposed not so specific as like this is a science fiction story, but like this is a steampunk story and this is a gothic story. It'll dictate specifically what the story's elements are. Do you guys have any thoughts on that, or?
I guess I sometimes consciously write steampunk, but then I realize that the way that I consciously write steampunk is actually very different than how other people necessarily interpret steampunk. So, for example, the biggest critique I got of A Steampunk's Guide to the Apocalypse is, why is this steampunk? Steampunk has nothing to do with the apocalypse. And I didn't really care. And I was like, I'm a steampunk, and this is my guide to the apocalypse. So, I like these ideas of mining the past. It's sort of actually a weird cultural appropriation of the past, which is obviously something that we need to be really conscious of. I also really like framing things in a fake 19th century kind of aesthetic, because I like, I think that the political conflict of the 19th century was more honest than the 21st century. I think all of our class issues and all of our race issues are completely still present in the 21st century, but we don't talk about them. I'm willing to bet almost everyone in this room identifies as middle class, and I'm willing to bet almost everyone in this room has vastly different incomes. And in the 19th century, it was kind of clear. Like, you were the oppressed or the oppressor. So you had this kind of class war consciousness, and you had this, people hadn't been betrayed by the concept of revolution, as what happened mostly in the 20th century. So I find the 19th century to be very rich. Not even necessarily writing in the 19th century, but with these ideas. So to me, I actually do write very consciously steampunk, but every now and then there's clanking machines, but there's very rarely bionic arms, and but I like airships. So it's really random, and I'm really into the idea that people can make steampunk what they want, and not be. I've actually written a lot about the idea that we shouldn't use labels to define ourselves, but we can use labels to describe ourselves. Because the easiest way to describe the aesthetic of what I'm talking about is usually steampunk, but it would be really a crap way to limit myself. And so I think people get really upset when things stick out a little bit from the box, but I'm obviously not very interested in living in boxes. So, yeah.
Okay, well, as far as the toolbox is concerned, I think there is, there are really several things there. First of all, I will argue, and you can beat me up afterwards. I will argue that steampunk actually started as a literature movement, so it's pretty much, the very definition, the very term came from, mid-80s books. Then it morphed into something completely different, and it seems like really the subculture is not literature-based at all, in many ways. But I would argue that Genesis actually was very much literary, and the reason for that, I think, is really, what's interesting about books is people. Everybody writes about human condition. However, steampunk really gives you a whole new set of things to throw at people. For example, having technological developments to people who might not necessarily be able to use it, or having technological development available to people to whom it was not previously available, and so they can change their circumstances. So much of the world that we're living in today is based on the 19th century, and this is, colonialism. I'm sorry, guys, if I'm venturing into. But really like, why is coffee grown in South America? Why is chocolate produced in Africa? All of those colonialism, because those Europeans who brought it there, Europeans who started plantations, Europeans who started modern day production. So really, this impulse to write about 19th century, it's really the desire to kind of revisit some of the things that were happening during that time and really see how they could have played differently and how it would affect the world that we're living in today. For example, if I may be so bold, in Heart of Iron, which is my book that is coming out in July, it's about Crimean War, but it is written from the Russian perspective. And it is also important to remember that the Taiping Rebellion was taking place in the same time. And basically, what I'm asking is, what if Russia had a railroad system that went all the way through Siberia to China? What if Russia was able to ally with Taiping Republic against, the British and the Ottoman empires? What would happen then? How different would the world be? And really, this is just a really fun sandbox, but it allows you to ask interesting and I think important questions as well.